All right, everybody. Well, thanks again for coming. We're going to do our next demo. I'm just going to knock out a pretty basic forge knife because, you know, we get into some of these more complex, you know, types of techniques, and I like to always make sure that we just do a quick knife real quick on the anvil. And then what I'll do is I'll try to change this lav out. But I've got a TV Magic one that I forged the other day. And so I'm going to go over, and Ivy's going to kind of do the filming thing. So a lot of times at the grinder, it's really hard to see down what we're going to do. So instead of everybody trying to jam in over there, you can just chill, and we'll get really close in on the grinder. And hopefully the lav will pick and everything. So we'll do it like that. Better, better, better. Cool. All right. I'll be scratching off a little bit, so you're going to get my sparks, okay? But I'll try to aim them down. Like I said, I like to start off with the basic knife. This is actually pretty much the format that we teach in our 2-day forge knife making class. And there are a lot of ways to make a knife, and there's a lot of ways to put in the handle and put in the point. And so we just kind of have settled on this. I'm letting it heat up right now. I'm going to be forging some 3/16 80 Sierra V2. I got to cut the pieces off anyway, so I'll cut them a little diagonal to make the point a little easier. It is really cool to make a point out of a square end, but it can be more difficult, especially when we're teaching. It's somebody's first time forging. We like to do that. So generally, when you have a square end, it's easy for that to become a fish mouth. The points of the square end tend to curl over unless you control that. Now, the wider your stock, so say you're starting with 1/4 inch or thicker, the more likely it is to just become a point. But when it's thin stock, it does really weird stuff. And we tend to like to start with stock that's pretty close to what the thing is that we make. Most of the knives that we make here at Joiner Die are stock removal knives. We have laser cut stainless. If we can take a lot of this forge effort out of the knife, then we can sell it for less. And they're already not cheap, so we're trying to make them as accessible to as many people as possible. Also, when I started to learn more about the metallurgy of steel, I started to learn that there was no benefit, and I know it's going to be a little bit controversial, there's no benefit to forging a knife, especially when a monosteel knife, when you do good thermocycling and heat treating. And so actually, most of the time when you forge carbon steel, you're actually creating grain growth, and you're actually creating problems in your steel from overheating in the forge that then need to be corrected with normalizing, which is just making the grain go from coarse and big down to nice and fine and thin. So, but when I need to forge a knife because of the shape of the knife, or maybe I have a weird piece of steel that wasn't really the right shape, but I can get the knife I need, or I want to make Damascus or San Mai or some of those things, then I'll forge it. Also, I like making integral bolster knives because those kind of technically could be milled, but they pretty much have to be forged, and that's something that you can't really fake. So I like making integral blades. I did a small integral last year by hand, and we may look at doing one a little bit later. We'll see what Ben Abbott wants to play with. But for now, we're just going to forge a regular knife. I'll need my pickup tongs here. So the first thing we'll do is just get our point established. That's what I like to do first anyway. So it's very important to forge the thing while it's hot and not try to keep forging once it gets kind of cold. it's just really easy to want to keep working on it, you know? So part of whether it's a knife or really any smithing is striking while the iron's hot. And I find that people that can control themselves and hit it while it's hot and get it right back in, they're going to take shorter heats, but they're going to be done faster. Because they're going to be, every time you swing this hammer on cold steel, it's kind of like not much is going to happen. So we want to make sure that. And then another thing is how hard I hit it or the weight of my hammer is really going to affect what happens to the steel. So I find that whenever I hit it real hard, that the cross-sectional thickness of the material will change a lot. But if I hit it light, it will mush out the surface of the steel, but not actually change the overall shape as much. So the idea of planishing you might hear about with a really small hammer is we don't really want to mess with our shape, but we want to take out the bumps and lumps. And so whenever I have people that are not hitting hard enough, they can be hitting on that knife for half an hour and it'll look a lot like it did when they started. So you got to make sure that our strikes are good. So a lot of times I ask people to just kind of slow down, hit it at the right heat, bring that hammer up high. Now, in my opinion, this does not have a belly and a spine, although it looks like it does, because I could just change the position of this. As long as I have good cross-sectional thickness and it's not paper thin, I can move this back and forth. And so what I mean is, I want to do it at heat. I'll go ahead and change that though. So I'm curved this way. I can just curve it the other. I get a lot of people that are hung up on like, yeah, but my knife is faced this way. I don't really have to do that. Now there is a lot of lore around knife making and smithing. There's the idea of like packing the edge on a knife. And that's the idea of tamping down the cutting edge when you're close to done to kind of compress the edge so it'll be better for edge holding. It seemed like that was what was going on, but now we know that we were doing normalizing cycles. We were actually improving the grain while we were doing that. And so it seemed like it was our proactive hammering that was doing it, but it was really the normalizing that was happening. So if I'm not comfortable with the directionality of that, I can bring it down, create a fulcrum and hit past it. You'll have to take my word for it, but that's now the opposite way. So the spine was here, now it's there. So we can go back and forth with that. Sometimes I'll go ahead and establish that early. It kind of depends on design, but if I'm going for a very specific design, then sometimes I want to make sure that I kind of have that linear angle the way I want it. I go ahead and put a notch in now for my handle. I want to kind of establish and preload the steel in the areas. I'm not really doing knife design right now. The reason I like to do the point early is because it kind of establishes a length that end is going to have. And for me, it's sometimes hard to guesstimate what's going to be correct unless I have that. Sometimes you'll hear it. People will go, man, I just get in there and just let the steel kind of tell me. And I like to just say, no, you are in charge of this process. The steel is just there. If you don't have the ability to execute your plan, then that might be a good excuse for it. But you want to be, now, so the thing is that a master at this craft would say, yeah, I'm going to go in and let it happen. You know what I mean? And something's going to come out great. But if I don't have some kind of plan going in, it's just maybe luck if it comes out good. So we like to really come in with a plan. And it's just so much harder. It takes more skill to have that plan and execute it. And so you don't get a pass. If something's not going right, you have to figure out how to fix it rather than say, let me just go with it. I think it really improves your skill if you're willing to take that challenge. I gotta get I'm dumping my knife way down in this forge here and there because I just want full back heat on this. So some heat that's not technically necessary to give me a little bit longer to forge. So I'm just gonna put a notch in here. There's a few ways to do this, but I just like to go across my anvil and come down on here, right into the corner. It just puts a notch in. Flatten that out. Thank you. Now, I'm hammering on the flat over and over, but the reason is because as I hammer on the top like this, it's going to also widen the steel there. It generally doesn't widen the steel in the middle. The middle will stay the same thickness, but the edges will tend to widen. And so I have to flatten them back out. If I don't, I will end with a bow tie or an I-beam type cross-sectional shape, which is no good. And what will happen is I will forge this thing. It'll look like a great looking knife, but then I'll have all these ridges I got to take out, and those are just going to mush out the side. And sometimes, if you're doing that later in the process, you can kind of get into a point of no return. So we want to keep it flat the whole time. Now I'm going to flip it over. You might have noticed that even though I was working on the handle, I was holding it by the handle. There's a reason for that. When I'm across the anvil in this setting, what I'm going to do is hold it at 45 degrees and hit it with a half face strike. But what's most likely is that I'm not going to be perfectly 45. I'm probably going to be a little low just because of my body mechanics, okay? But what that's going to do is that's going to give me a hard corner down here and a soft edge on this side. So that's going to play out into my handle. You can already see it with this. That's just the natural shape going across the anvil if I'm still holding it. It's, you know, you're going to feel like working on your handle, you want to flip it around and hold it from the point. But it's nice, just if you're doing it this way, to be holding it that. And that's going to lay that down. And what I can do now is I can hit more there. But I am going to turn that around. Now, I've seen a lot of people will start a handle by just holding the tip side and go ahead and go that way. That's a good way too. Now, it's just going to be one of those like, hey, check me out, I can hammer, because I'm not really designing anything. I'm just moving this steel down to the thickness. Again, preloading it into the shape that it needs to be. Just drawing that out right now. I was drawing that out on the flat of the anvil, but I can definitely do that on the horn, get a little bit of a quicker effect. I like to get the handle drawn out to its approximate length that it needs to be before adding any handle design. You can imagine if I make a cool finger well and get a handle design too early, I will then just need to stretch it out. And then it'll end up being a distorted, kind of overly long thing. You see it sometimes on Forged in Fire, on like the first round especially, when they have a length requirement and they're a little thin and they have to just make the thing a certain length, and so what they'll do is they'll stretch the handle out to just make the overall length correct, and they'll basically have like this real long with the finger wells not matching a human hand because it looked real nice early, but then they had to stretch it out. So we don't want to fall into that when we're just making a knife. So if I go on my guy here. Getting a little lumpy because I'm going a little more aggressive on it, but I don't care because I'm just positioning the handle material kind of where it needs to be. Now I'm staying off the very end of the tip and of the end of the handle. I don't really personally like handles that taper down to kind of be thinner in the back. I like them to be wider especially for everyday use. I would probably make an exception for some kitchen knives on that can taper down, but the general pulling motion that you might want to do with a knife, you want to have some kind of a positive grip there if you're doing that with, you know, especially slippery hands. I can always crush it later, but I'd rather leave it a little wider. I like to say it's like toothpaste in a tube. Especially on a stock like this, whether it's a knife or something else, once it goes out the end, it's not going to be able to be put back. And so we want to make sure not to forge too long, too early. I was thinking I might make a couple different knives out of the same knife. Make like a short, compact, like Hunter, and then show you in just a couple of heats how we can make something like a Petty Chef out of the same material after making that. Now, by the way, does it look like my handle's a little short, right? Pretty short. Well, one thing is I'm drawing it out. I'm drawing the length out. We're getting a little bit more length there. But my starting stock on this was 6 inches. And of course it was diagonal. And I cut across right at the middle of that diagonal is where the 6 inches were. But so the reason why my handle's a little short is that I can always borrow a little bit more from my blade into my handle. But a lot of times when you put those details into your handle, you're now not in a position to widen that out into a blade. So if you have to make adjustments later on in the process, I'd rather have blade I can take from than handle I can take from. So if I err on the side of a short handle and a long blade. 3/16, a little bit on the thick side. So now I'm kind of at a point where I can start thinking about this. I can't put my palm on this to figure out like how long I want it, right? Because that'll be uncomfortable for me. But I can put my palm on my anvil and be like, how long should it be? So for me, on this Peter Wright, my palm is about the width from the heel to the hardy hole. So now I can put the handle across that. If it's not lining up for you, just use you some soapstone and mark on there where you want it. You need obviously a little bit longer than your hand, but just measuring that out. So I'm like, I don't know, still probably a little short. Well, no, that's, so I'm about the same, the length of my palm right now. So I need another, just a little bit to go out, a little bit extra. So let's put a finger choil in here. When it comes to my anvil, it's one of my tools too. It's not just a surface. It's got all these great textures. So I could put a finger choil in with the end here by crushing the knife into the horn. And if I'm on my horn, if I hold my knife on it and I hit past it, I'm just gonna wrap the material around the horn. But if I hit on the horn, I'm gonna crush the horn into the material. Simple as that. So if I want more texture that the horn could give me, then I can crush it into the horn. Give myself a nice finger well there. And that put right in. But if I want to bend the material without actually crushing it, I hit past it and it bends it around the horn. Simple as that. Still got a little bit, so I can maybe give myself another arc. Kind of exaggerating these forms a little bit just so we could see them really well. So now we got like a pistol grip. It's kind of like a Smith & Wesson Model 36. So anyway, I'm going to flip it around. We're going to mess around with the blade. And then, once I get this blade about where we want it, I'm going to show you how easy it is and how quick it is to transform it into a totally different kind of knife. Now, big question, do you forge your bevels in or not? Good question, right? So it's really nice on a stock removal knife to be able to lay it on a piece of granite or a flat surface and scribe the center line on your cutting edge. So you can have just perfect line down the middle, line of sight, cutting edge very straight, scribe it, maybe flip it, scribe it on both sides. I love to do that on my forged work too, because I'm like, it looks pretty straight, but you lay it on like a granite slab and you know, is it rocking, what's it gonna do? So what I can do is I can grind it clean, put some ink on and scribe a center line. So I do actually like to oftentimes not forge bevels in, especially if I'm going for a pattern, because I'm like, I need to make this exact knife. I got that pattern, and if I forge bevels in, I'm gonna actually widen my knife. Forging bevels in is great though if I'm not quite meeting my pattern, my steel is a little low, I can actually get more knife by forging bevels in. A really big thing, I can actually save myself a lot of grinding by forging bevels in if it's a larger blade. But on a smaller blade, I mean, these ceramic belts just eat through it so fast, I can actually be more accurate when I have more material to work with. It's super straight on both sides. So it's just gonna be up to you. But generally, I don't like, 100% rules across the board. The answer is usually it depends. Let that get a little hot. So we'll let it cool down for a half a second before we do anything. All right. So we'll just put our point back kind of like where we want it. Okay, cool. So we more or less have a forged hunter now, something like that. We could tune that up a little bit. We could put our bevels in. It's got that cool like finger well. So I don't know. Let's see if we can make it into something that like you might want to use in the kitchen. Ooh. I think the first thing I'll probably do is actually draw the bevels out, like I just talked about not doing. But this is that example of, well, this thing would be okay in the kitchen, maybe like an apple, but like, you want a little more blade. My most popular kitchen blade is my kitchen cutlass, which is our 6-inch petty chef, because it just cuts everything. The 8-inch is great, but like most of the stuff that you do for dinner prep, you're not making huge amounts. And it'll handle a big onion and a big apple and root veggies, and so that 6-inch is something that in our kitchen we like to reach for. So we like making something that size. So I want to draw my heel out a little bit. I'm just going to be pinching the steel towards me. So I'm just widening that out because if we're going to be on a cutting board, we want to get our fingers up off that cutting board. The angle of my handle is going to be really important that if we're shifting into kitchen. Like, EDC or bushcraft, I mean, you might want to even have your handle kind of coming forward with a forward curve. There's all these different things. But as soon as you're thinking about cutting on a cutting board, it changes. You got to be able to get your fingers out of the way. You don't have to have it really high, because anybody that really cares about knives and cuts a lot is probably going to be using a pinch grip on their kitchen knife, which means that's going to pull their hand up and over, and it's going to just have those bottom knuckles around the bottom rather than that ham-fisted, hammer grip. But so we don't need that much, but we do want that angle correct. So when I do my bevel, I'm going to have the spine a little bit up off the anvil. I was taught to do it right at the edge here, which is great, but generally if your hammer blows are accurate, you can do it wherever. Okay, so another thing that's going to happen when I forge the bevel in is it's going to actually curve my point back. Now, some people forge the same knife enough to where they know exactly how much to forge it forward, so when they forge it forge the bevel in, it just goes right where they want it. But generally, I'm not generally doing the exact same knife over and over, so it's like kind of hard to tell. But you can also just bevel, correct, bevel, correct. But if I want to forge a distal taper into this knife, which just means the whole spine is tapering down to the point from the handle. You got me? Okay. So the distal taper effectually means a bevel on the other side. That's going to correct the angle of my point if I forge a distal taper in. So see how it's a little back? So let's just forge that on this side. Did y'all hear a difference in the sound when it got cooler? You can feel and hear the difference when you're forging at the correct heat. Now I'll continue forging after it's too cool, but I'm actually bringing the strength of my blows down so that I'm really more just starting to do some like corrective here and there stuff rather than trying to change the shape. If it's for the kitchen, I want it to be really thin. Just like Greg talked about, like if it looks thin enough, it's probably too thick. Every time I forge a knife, I get it cold over there, I grind the outside edges off. Every time it looks bigger than I thought it was. Something about the heat or whatever, it just changes your perception of it. And so I think I'm thin enough and I'm not. Something about going to the edge of disaster is almost always where the good stuff is. Keep going. So another indication that I'm getting into a good thickness is that even when it's hot, it's really resisting me. It's bouncing up because when it gets really thin like that, it's just really harder to forge. But we just have to like be willing to, like the first 2 heats, I can probably do more technical material removal than the next, 5 or 6. Jamie, grab me a water. Yeah. So I could certainly grind that to shape. Sometimes it's nice to really tune that really nice. Right back here at the heel, it's not as tall as it is kind of in the middle. It really is nice to have that back heel to be your highest point. I've been told, I've had some customers they like to rock and they wanted it to curve up some, but generally as you come down on the cutting board, you want it to be effective all the way back. You don't want to have some of your cilantro or scallions not quite getting that cut. But some people want a really sharp heel because they'll actually pull that kitchen knife up and use that sharp heel for, tiny little paring tasks when they have the big one. Other people will be like, hey, I cut myself on the heel, can you dull it? Personal preference. What no one really likes are like the Sabatier style huge bolsters on these chef knives. There's just a bunch of metal like in between you and the cutting surface. But I think that really had to do with just, commercial kitchens and kind of keep people safe. So let's make that heel a little taller. I'm going to be a little more careful about how I do this. I'm going to pinch some of this material out with my cross peen like this. So I'm forging right in through here to only push it out that way and a little bit backwards. And I'm just pinching away there. So I can really be selective about where I do that. Let me get a, that's not the right. Might be easier with a standard cross peen. I got this knife from Brent Bailey out in California. He's a hammer maker, and it's a straight peen. And it's just kind of like stylized. It's just like, you know, you might like to drive a certain looking truck or guitar or something. That's my hammer. But the straight peen is real cool for knife makers because there's a lot of times I just feel like I'm using that direction more than the cross peen. And you can have more than one. So at this point, you're seeing I'm using the brush a lot more just because we're kind of getting near the end of the forging. So I want it cleaner. Lose a lot of heat really quick, but look at that. It's starting to look like a cut chef knife. So one more heat there probably. And then I don't really want, I actually, on a lot of my sabers and stuff, I keep that little finger choil. People like it. It's kind of a good balance point. I was just going to mash that out, but I might not do it. But I need to tune that up just to make sure that I have the right angle kind of for a cutting board. Because that's one thing. While it's hot, you can crank and completely change where that steel is, right? If you let it cool down, you'll never grind it up, right? You know, you can only just take stuff off of one side. So I got my heel a lot more like I want. It looks more like a knife now. My tip I probably got a little toasty. When we get over to the grinder, we'll have to see what's left of that. But I have noticed when you're going to be forging a lot, in and out of the forge a lot, you can leave the tip like either squared off or just like real chunky. And then the last thing you do could be to put that tip in. That's especially with like forge welding temperature and stuff. And I cranked this forge because I wanted it to heat up quick, and then I forgot I cranked it, so it's a little hot. Shouldn't need to do much here. Just gonna tweak this a little. Okay, I'll leave the finger well in, but we're just gonna go a little longer with the handle. Bringing it out. Again, it looks smaller in the forge and it'll look bigger. A lot of times I'll have people go, you know, I ruined my handle, it got so small. And I'll say, just go over to the case, grab a couple knives, grab some of the ones that look thin, grab them, see if they're comfortable. Then measure them. And they'll oftentimes, cross-sectionally at the thinnest point, be something like 3/4 of an inch tall, at like where at the smallest part where you grip it. And so oftentimes it just looks like way too small on the anvil, and it's not. But they can get too small, so just don't do that. Probably. All right, that's fine. A note about hammer blows and hammer use. Like, I'm not the biggest guy, and so when I move a fridge, I have to like pivot it and rotate it, you know, and like it'll just lift stuff above my head. And so I found the same thing with hammers. Like, I can just, if I get the right amount of kind of a whip on this, let it go free, bring it up high, there's a lot of just natural physics that are going to make those blows just rock that steel. But if I try to like use my muscles to do it, it's terrible. It doesn't work. Now, bigger dudes may be able to rely on their muscles, and that's a bummer for them because they don't have to. You can let that hammer do that work. But I want to see, when people are forging, I want to see that hammer come up. So if you have to slow down, that's more work than this, generally. It also does depend on the part of the process, because with planishing, I want to get a lightweight hammer. It's too light. something like this and just kind of play whack-a-mole. Make the low places high and the high places low. And once on the blade. So, I don't know if the taco guy's here, but he was a little running late. There's a lot of traffic. So after I'm done, I think they'll be set up. So they were running a little late, but they'll be set up by the time we go out, hopefully. And you're in for a treat if you haven't had TBT El Gallo. Another thing I can do here is just kind of see if I have any bumps or lumps that I don't want in this blade. There was a question about decarb earlier. I have found that it is plainly visible in steel, even if the steel is completely ground clean. Especially when you get to a higher grit, there's these little dots and stuff in it. Decarb is very clear. If you really don't know and you're concerned, dip it in ferric chloride. Your etchant that's for Damascus, and your decarb will be light gray, and your steel will be black. And so, light gray in the etch or just some modeling texture in the surface when you're grinding is very obvious. So, and I mentioned that because obviously my tip is real thin, but like I said, it'll probably look thicker once it's cooled down. I wonder if it gets bigger or if it just looks bigger. You know? Pretty flat. When straightening, I always switch to regular tongs that can pick it up from either side, because I gotta be able to sight the whole thing, and any kind of tongs that wrap your project are gonna really obscure that vision. It makes a huge difference. Probably not gonna go crazy. Another thing about putting in that bevel is your bevel is almost never going to stay in the middle. When you get your spine straight, your bevel is either going to be snaking all around or laid down to one side. And so that's another process that you got to go through. And another reason why you may want to skip the bevel, depending on your knife project. And then you got Damascus to think about. Some Damascus patterns, you need to grind really deep down into them to make them look cool, because they're just kind of lines on the surface but like swirly in the middle. And so sometimes we'll make decisions about how much we're going to grind on the thing based on the pattern. These San Mai guys like Greg, they want to have the absolute perfect amount of core steel sticking out. So they got to do a few bullets to know how much to leave, you know? All right. That's all I'm going to do there. Now, Benai's going to follow me, and I'm just going to do some grinding on one real quick, okay? So if you're over here, you can kind of, you know, come look in person, but we'll have it on the TV screen real close up. I need a flat platen. I'm going to grind on this one, and it's missing. There it is. All right, cool. So I definitely got to give a shout out to Klingspor Abrasives. They're my abrasive supplier. They're not as popular as I think they should be in the knife making world, because they're kind of one of those old school companies that doesn't like do like the internet and Instagram marketing. They don't name their belts stuff like the Violator and the Confiscator, but they make really good products. And unfortunately, with their ceramics, There's a red ceramic belt that they make that actually isn't very good. It's not really made for hardened steel. But our green ceramics, which are our CS920Ys, are every bit as good as like Norton Blaze or whatever. Everybody admits that the 3M Cubitron shoes are the best, but no one knows how to make them. So this one is, I thought I had a non-ground one. I'm going to use this other one instead. So I'm going to take the recurve out of this. Okay, so through TV magic, we have holes drilled and like a rough cut on this. You got it? Yeah. All right, cool. So, okay, cool. We'll do more. I'm going to switch the thing. Screen mirroring, Roku, BIP, BIP. Y'all got that over there now? Awesome. Cool, so come on over here. So what I like to do for grinding is establish my cutting edge, knock the burr off. We use a carbide scribe, although you know what? I'm going to have to use a 3/16. Can somebody hand me a 3/16 inch drill bit from over there, please? I like Dychem. Here, put that on the camera. Dychem. It's just a layout fluid for machinists and stuff. It's a fingernail polish for machinists, actually. It's a really pretty blue, too. So that dries really about instantly. Should just anything up on the, okay, cool, yeah. So, 3/16 there, that's an 1/8. So essentially what I can do is I can match the thickness of my knife, whether it's stock removal or forged, with the drill bits that's the same thickness. I really like the carbide scribes from like, you can order them or you can get them at Depot, like this. But they're, you pull this out and they're 1/8 of an inch thick when you pull them out. And that's great for 1/8 inch stock. I need 3/16 is big, is a little bit bigger. It's in between 1/8 and 1/4. We got a bunch of them over there. Yeah, perfect. Cool. So this is going to be about the right thickness. Pretty similar. If it's a little bit off, that's fine. It's going to make 2 scribe marks. So you don't have to have granite, but oftentimes you can get a little piece of granite for real cheap or free off of a kitchen demo or something. So we're just going to scribe with the drill bit center. You can hear that. Scribe it on the other side, and we should get a line. How are we looking? Oftentimes that gives me 2 lines, which I kind of like. If I have 2 lines with a little bit of ink in the middle, I can leave the ink. But if the lines line up, I'll leave the line. So what I'm going to do is break my 90. I'm going to take the corners off of this project so that I'll have the corners, I'll have a physical grind to work on instead of just a mark. Real close. And that's right to my line. So that breaks my 90, and it gives me a little bit of flat on there. I do not want this sharp. There won't be anything left if I let it be sharp. I also got to keep it cool. Probably bring this over. Okay, so breaking the 90, people generally don't have a big problem with. It's increasing that bevel is really tough because it's kind of a black box. It's happening between you and the grinder, and you can't see it because the knife is in the way. So there's a lot of feel going on here. There's a lot of practice. This is sort of one of those grind 100. But there are a little bit some visual cues. And one is that there's just going to be a little shadow between the cutting edge and the abrasive. So the first thing I'm going to do now that I've got my 90 broke is I'm just going to clean this cutting edge off by lightly cleaning that off. Now that's silver, and I can see it better. I can't see it better. Let's see, I can't see it as good against my bevels, but when I put it against put it real close in on that. So now I can see that real good. So I'm going to cut this on, keep it close. From above going down. Like there. Okay, got it? Right there. Light. Okay. Other side. I try to show that shadow the absolute best you can. So I hope this makes sense, but there's a tiny little black line of a shadow between the cutting edge and the abrasives. You can kind of see it there, but it looks even better when the belt is going because you don't have the texture of the belt. And that little shadow is just going to keep you off your edge and just right on the back of that bevel. Because we're just trying to slowly bring the bevel back. It can be really tough to not move this, but one of the reasons why people, I think, a lot of times have problems grinding, believe it or not, is that they're gripping too tightly and not. It's not that they're too loose. So they're not allowing any feel of where this thing is supposed to be. Instead, all the way through their back, shoulders, arms, and fingers, they're white knuckling it. And so a lot of times if I can get people to shake it out and loosen up a little bit, they can grind better. I'm going to continue. And then another thing, you'll hear this talk about grinding, but I really try to keep the knife close in, keep my head really close into my work. All your power and control is close in, just like in the forge. And my movement, I'm going to try to do swaying with my body and not trying to move with my hands. You could just hold your hands out and notice that you just don't have as much articulate control out here as you do bringing your body across there like that. So that's what we're going to do. So this is an as-forged blade, so there's going to be a little bit of texture in this line. If it was real lumpy, it would be sort of up and down here because the bevel and the flats interact to create that plunge line. And especially if you have a cleaned off blade, you can actually grind on your flat to meet your bevel to change where that line ends. And so if I overground a little bit on my bevel, but I want it to look like the other side, I can grind on the flat to bring it down to interact just right. But generally, on these forged knives, we actually like the look, so we'll grind the bevel, make it really pretty, but have a little bit of forged texture there and grind it off. Some of you may have noticed some color that came up on this. That blue color is too much heat and can wreck the edge. This knife is pre-heat treat and is not hardened, so I don't really care about that. I'm going to do some normalizing. Now, because it's pre-heat treat, I need at least this much on the cutting edge. I would say that's probably a full 1/16 there. And if it's a little thin, then I can just kind of knock it back just a little bit. So I do need some thickness for my heat treat. I have a really thick spine on this one, so I'm not going to be super worried about that. But if I'm grinding after heat treat, whether from our full thickness or if it's pre-ground, I got to be a little bit more careful, maybe a little slower and a sharper belt because of controlling heat. This belt was not new, and so I just wanted to be clear about that as far as how it ground great, but it wasn't even a new belt, and so we really like these. That is our grinding. I'm going to come back over to the forge. So there's a lot to grinding. That's just the basics, but some of those tips we just try to help with people. Just having that little shadow there. Did anybody notice that I would put it on and it would kind of hiss like, and then all of a sudden I would lean into it and it'd be like, that's another thing is if you can lock in with a lot of pressure on that, you're going to be able to get a lot of really good passes. Whereas if you're a little lighter and more tentative, you're actually going to struggle. Believe it or not, also real sharp abrasives are going to be easier. They give you a much more consistent pull that you can predict, whereas the well-used abrasives that are a little slicker, there tends to be a little slick jumping around on those. And then one other thing is trying to focus your effort. So if I'm on my grinder on my right side, you're going to see most of the sparks are going to be on the right side of the belt. Not on the corner, but just the right half of that belt. I'm focusing down what I'm actually grinding, and I'm changing the position of the knife to work that side of the belt. Left side, move over to that side. I'm not just, that 2-inch doesn't seem very wide, but there's a lot that can happen. There's something known as the 2-inch bite, especially on longer knives like chef knives, and you get a little divot 2 inches in from where you start grinding because the other side of your platen did something that you didn't realize was happening. So if we could really try to focus all of our efforts, just that ever so slight tweak in the angle so that we're really digging in almost diagonally across our platen, we're going to get our best grinds. It's something that most people probably come to without ever planning or thinking about that happening. They just, once they started to kind of ease up on that other side, things started to go a little better. But yeah, using a coarse belt and getting in there real hard with it, once you've done a few and you feel like you can, is going to give you that more consistent grind. Now, just like sharpening, we want to make the geometry the way we want it with our most coarse and aggressive belt. We want to get on down to the shape that we want with whatever we want to do. So like this, I was using a 60. A lot of my smaller knives, I do everything I was using a 36 with this one. A lot of times use a 60 with my smaller knives, anything bigger, 36 to start with. I'm going to get that thing pretty close to the shape that I want it because everything over your coarsest belt is surface conditioning. Even if it's a 60, you're just going to gradually fine tune. And another thing from 60 I've learned from batch grinding is I don't make them all super perfect. I get all the meat and I get the thickness established, but I'm like, oh, this plunge is a little different than that one. Grind, throw it off the side, grind, throw it off the side. And then as I go 60, those are going to get a little better. 120, those are going to get a little better too. And so the last thing I'll say is about your abrasives. You can jump from 60 to 220. You can do it. If you're going to make one knife, you probably should. If you've got a good fresh 220, you can probably get, if it's not an enormous knife. But if you use more grits, you'll use less belts. If you go 36, 60, 120, 220, 400, whatever, or maybe even more, then each one of those belts will wear out slower. And so you'll start with 4 belts, but you'll use those 4 belts longer than the 2 belts that you tried to jump. That's oftentimes, and it's a heat control thing too. Jumping from 60 to 120 is a lot easier and doesn't require as much time on the grinder, and you're using those sharper belts. So that's a hard one because we all have gone through that. Belts are very expensive. So we've all gone through that situation where it's hard to pay for the belts. They say use them like they're free. It's just not reasonable. No one will do that. So, but be thinking of it like that. Like, okay, But the surface, the final thing, the surface conditioning, when I'm getting up into that 220, even on like a bushcraft or a bigger knife, I want to get my edge pretty thin. A knife's just not going to be a cutter if it's big and fat right behind the cutting edge. It's just going to be hard to sharpen. You're going to take a lot of steel off. Sure, it'll be durable, but I mean, a railroad spike's durable. You know, if you need a pry bar, that's so. You know, a bushcraft type blade that has more of a blunt tip, that has a not as tall of a bevel, you can still bring that down almost to a zero edge. If the overall geometry is correct, you can do that and get away with it. And the same thing on a kitchen knife. It's like, man, that kitchen knife can about be dull. If it's nice and thin, at least a ½ an inch above that cutting edge, or maybe a little higher, real thin, it's going to pass through that apple. It's just going to go through because it's real thin, and it'll be easier to sharpen. So I have determined for myself that the overall geometry is more important than the edge sharpness on a knife when it comes to its performance. And again, the edge sharpness is something that's pretty easy to tweak later, take to a guy, but how you make that knife overall, geometry-wise, is a lot harder to fix later. So it's just, they just keep getting thinner for me, to be honest with you, because they just pass right through that paper, and people go, ooh, you know. So anyway, that concludes this demo. We'll have a little lunch break and stuff and hang out, and then we'll be back with the demo afterwards. Thanks, guys.